And it could be decades until we possibly uncover enough information from the Russian
Right.
side of it to even understand. And of course, the recent, silly spy case that was in the news here only illustrates that this type of thing is continuing to go on at
Sure.
all kinds of levels that we couldn't possibly understand. So,
Right.
all right, so let me keep moving through past sort of the Nazi, the the World War II version of history. I think is the one that most people know. My parents actually had just recently purchased a house on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and my father, in particular, has been reading books about the U-boats that were patrolling off the U.S. coast and a number
Right.
of other things that, at least when I was growing up, you wouldn't read about in history books. You wouldn't hear about these things just discussed in classes. It was mostly that we were over in Europe. The United States, was over in Europe fighting the war, not that they were bringing the war to us.
Yes.
Further than that, though, would be the Nazi presence, the way that they were negotiating politically, well documented cases of their involvement down in South America. I know that you've
Yes.
documented quite a bit of this yourself, Argentina, Brazil, and other places. Can we just touch on that very quickly? I mean, is that still maybe a thriving thing, or was this sort of tracing footsteps of, we're a few steps behind, but this is where they were?
Well, it's a little bit of both, actually. There is still a very heavy presence of Germans in a particular area of Argentina that immediately after the war was one of their major compounds. It's an area of Argentina known as Rio Negro province. It's about 900 miles southwest of Buenos Aires, out in the boonies, so to speak. But during the war, the Nazis had purchased some 10,000 square miles of Argentina. In other words, this is an area the size of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a pretty sizable area. So there was a Nazi compound within about 100 miles. If you draw a circle around the Argentinian town of San Carlos de Bariloche, within that circle there is a Nazi compound that is quite large and that was quite active after the war. Now, one of the things I point out is that from about 1948 to 49 up to about 1951, there was a Nazi research project going on in that town under a Nazi scientist by the name of Dr. Ronald Richter, which was, in my opinion, and I argued the case at more length in the Nazi International, that this project was a continuation of aspects of the Nazi Bell project. So in other words, I depart company with my colleagues Nick Cook and Igor Vitkovsky, who've also researched this story.
I was going to bring those names up, okay.
Well, they came to the conclusion that the Bell Project came to this country and went into our own deep black projects. I do not think so. All the evidence that I've uncovered suggests to me that if you connect the dots and do so with an eye to the details, that this project did not fall into American hands or British hands or French hands or Soviet hands after the war. The Nazis made good and sure that the project remained in their hands after the war, and they continued to investigate it.
Wow, that's amazing. So
yeah.
would this be some sort of this is this is what made preparing for this interview so difficult, because I couldn't possibly keep up with this amount of information despite my best efforts. The gentleman you just referred to a few moments ago that was the senior scientist, I'll say, in charge of this, would he be an equivalent to von Braun, who, if I'm not mistaken, was the head man at NASA for many years? Are we talking about that exact same level where he was running a project possibly of that size and perhaps with that type of funding?
Well, there are a number of little picky details. Von Braun was never head of NASA, but he was certainly a senior administrator within NASA. And he certainly was one of the more instrumental figures in the design of the Saturn V booster with fellow Nazi Artur Rudolph. Good old American know-how.
Right.
Which, to recite the old Tom Lehrer song. But the fellow down in Argentina, his name was Dr. Ronald Richter. And yes, I'd have to say that he occupied a similar position within the hierarchy of scientists down there doing this research. And I also would have to conclude that given the scale of the ruins that you can still see in this region of Argentina, of his laboratories and what he was up to, that the funding for this project, which ostensibly came from Juan Perón, we'll get back to that in a minute, that the funding for this project was extraordinary. This was not a small laboratory effort.
Sure.
But the funding, to get back to Juan Perón for a minute, the reason why Perón was sort of chosen as the front man for this project was, of course, he first of all was a Nazi-phile, if you can imagine anyone post-World War II actually admiring these people. But the point of fact is that Juan Perón and Martin Bormann had a joint bank account in Buenos Aires sitting on top of some $800 million of 1945 dollars in liquid cash assets. Now, that's a hefty chunk of change. And when you're dealing, I like to tell people that when you're dealing with the likes of Martin Bormann, you're dealing with Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm. This is not a guy to be tangled with, not even if you're Juan Perón. So my conclusion, based on the evidence that I uncovered investigating this Argentinian project, was basically that Richter was not really answering to Perón. He was simply the front man for his Nazi masters, and he answered directly to the Nazis.
That is amazing. You're listening to Time and Space. We're speaking with Dr. Joseph Farrell today. I'm Mike Smith, your host, and I want to keep moving through here. There's a couple of endpoints that I'm really excited to try to get to, so I'm sort of working through a few maybe miscellaneous notes that don't necessarily relate directly to your work and research that you've done, but I think tie in, and we'll kind of move through and get to some of those. Let's talk about South America again for just a minute. I heard an amazing legend, a story of a German journalist who had met a Brazilian, I'll say, tribesman by the name of Tutunkanara that had possibly emerged from missing cities by the name of Akakor and others. Have you heard of these legends, and do they tie into your work in any respects that you know of?
Well, I do not cite this. It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because the Chronicles of Akakor was actually a book that was published first in Germany, where this story was first told.
Right.
I do not refer to it directly in any of my books, but I do mention on my website that there is odd corroboration of this, because the German SS did, prior to the war, mount an expedition to Brazil in search of some sort of lost cities. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with the SS, you're dealing with a quest for lost technology and anything that might be learned from it. So, in other words, there's always a military purpose when you're dealing with these guys. But yeah, there is a certain kernel of truth to this legend of Akakor. I don't refer to it, as I say, directly in any of my books, but there is a kernel of truth to it.
And that's the kind of thing that's touched on, especially by UFO researchers that love to point out that stories from Hollywood, for example, seem to have all these strange kernels of truth in them.
Yes.
The really obvious mainstream one that I think a lot of people look at is something like the Raiders of the Lost Ark stories with the Nazis so heavily involved. But then you get into movies that are maybe slightly more obscure, such as the film Hellboy, and in the opening scene of that, they're dealing with time travel and planet-busting weapons and all this type of thing. And again, it's the Nazis that are being directly accused, if you will, of having these ties and conducting these sort of occult excavations, trying to dig in and tap into this type of stuff. So we'll get to the science again in just a moment, because that to me is just really, really that's stepping off the cliff to a degree I can hardly even keep up with. But I want to reach over into something else very quickly. I was really surprised. I heard a Dreamland interview one time that was done by Jim Mars, who obviously is somebody you must know fairly well, or at least
yes.
Yeah. And you guys seem to really be on the same page when it came to right here in our own solar system, and even closer right here on the moon, the idea of moon bases and other evidence within the solar system that a variety of things had gone on. Can you touch on that for just a minute and explain how you maybe came to these conclusions and what evidence you've looked at that brings you into that sort of arena?
Well, I have never maintained publicly or in any of my books that I believe that somebody has a secret moon base.
Sure.
What I do maintain is, I'm fairly good friends with Richard Hoagland and some other people who have been investigating those types of issues. I do maintain that there is solid prima facie evidence that there is something by way of lost technology or antique technology on the surface of the moon, on the surface of Mars, a couple of satellites of the gas giants, some of the asteroids, and so on and so forth. I do think that there are clear and palpable evidentiary reasons for believing that we are looking at a very, very ancient and very sophisticated technology in some of these cases. And I do think that the possibility exists that if we assume, let's go back to the Bell story just to kind of round this out. The Nazi Bell, in my opinion, was a project that was designed to be a gateway technology to give the Nazis three different things. First thing was independent and so-called free energy, to free Germany from energy dependence on foreign sources of energy. The second thing I think they were after with this project was a real viable, workable field propulsion technology, or in other words, anti-gravity. And then the third thing is if you are dealing with a technology that can manipulate gravity, you're dealing perforce with a technology that can manipulate space-time directly. Now, the standard view of modern physics will tell you, well, that would be fundamentally impossible because we simply don't have the energy to do that. Well, I'm not basing my conclusions on any of the standard models of physics. I do believe that there are viable alternative models of physics that have been carefully hidden from the public eye. And this is what I think the Nazis were investigating. So the third thing I think they were after was precisely what you said, a planet-busting doomsday weapon. And this is the frightening part, because if we then assume that this Bell project was successful, and I think there is, again, enough prima facie evidence to suggest that the Nazis had some success with it, and if they continued investigating it after the war, well, my word, Michael, we're dealing now with a project that's been in existence for at least 60 years since the end of World War II. So with enough money and manpower, theoretically, I have to entertain the possibility that the sky quite literally is the limit, and therefore I would have to hold open the possibility that somebody, by dint of advanced technology, may actually have covert bases on the moon or maybe even our near planetary neighbors.
That is amazing stuff. So let me dial in for just a minute on the 0 point